At Christmas, my son-in-law called me a stupid old man, mocking my knowledge of history with loud laughter. The room fell silent when one of the guests, his eyes wide, called me professor and shook my hand. My son-in-law's smug smile disappeared and his world fell apart. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. Listen, older man. I know for sure Gettysburg was in '64. Trevor's voice cut through the warmth of my library like a blade through silk. I set my coffee mug down with deliberate care, the ceramic clicking against the mahogany side table. My leather armchair creaked as I straightened. 40 years of academic composure holding firm despite the tremor in my chest. Actually, Trevor, it was July 1st through 3rd, 1863. The words came out measured, professorial, calm. Trevor's face flushed red above his expensive wool sweater. He slammed his palm against my mantelpiece, making the family photos jump. Enough. You're just an old fool who confuses facts. The fire crackled in the sudden silence. Emily shifted on the sofa between us, her hands twisting in her lap. Trevor, please. I've been studying this for 40 years, I said quietly, gripping my mug handle. The porcelain felt fragile like everything else in this moment. Yeah. Trevor wheeled around, his designer shoes squeaking on my hardwood floor. It may be time you stopped. That documentary I watched clearly said 64. You're losing it, Martin. Emily stood abruptly. That's enough. Her voice carried the sharp edge I remembered from her teenage years. Dad knows what he's talking about. Oh, great. Trevor threw his hands up. Now you're taking sides against your own husband. I'm not taking sides. I'm stating facts. Emily moved toward the coat closet, her movements quick and angry. Dad taught Civil War history for decades. Trevor's laugh held no humor. Taught? Past tense, Emily. Past tense for a reason. The words hit me like physical blows. I watched my son-in-law grab his black coat from the closet, his movements sharp with righteous indignation. Emily followed, her face pale but determined. Trevor, we're leaving, she announced, not meeting my eyes gladly. He shrugged into his coat with aggressive efficiency. I don't need to sit here and listen to confused ramblings from someone who doesn't know basic history. Emily finally looked at me. Her green eyes, my late wife's eyes, held apology and frustration in equal measure. Dad, It's fine, sweetheart. The lie came easily. A lifetime of protecting her kicking in. Drive safely. Trevor was already at the front door, his hand on the brass knob. Come on, Em. Let's go somewhere with people who live in reality. Emily hesitated for one heartbeat, then followed him out. The door closed with a soft click that seemed to echo through my suddenly empty house. I remained in my chair, listening to Trevor's BMW engine roar to life in my driveway. Through the window, I watched their headlights sweep across my snow-dusted lawn as they backed out. The red tail lights disappeared down Maple Street, leaving me alone with the dying fire and the word fool still ringing in my ears. Standing slowly, my knees protesting the movement, I walked to the window. The street looked peaceful under the December snow, other houses glowing with warm yellow light. Normal families having everyday Sunday dinners. I pressed my palm against the cold glass and watched until their taillights vanished completely into the Portland night. The front door closed with a finality that seemed to settle into my bones. I stood there for a moment, my hand still on the brass knob, listening to the silence that filled my house like water rushing into a broken ship. Fool. The word echoed in my mind, bouncing off the walls of my consciousness. 40 years of teaching, and this boy tells me I don't know basic facts. I strolled back to my library, past the family photos that had witnessed our confrontation. Emily's wedding pictures smiled at me from the mantelpiece, her radiant face next to Trevor's confident grin. How different that grin had looked tonight, twisted with contempt and certainty. My extensive library walls stretched before me, hundreds of volumes arranged with the precision of decades. I knew exactly where to find what I needed. My fingers traced along the worn spines until they found the familiar burgundy leather. Encyclopedia of American History, Volume 7. The book fell open in my hands like an old friend. I'd referenced these pages countless times, guiding young minds through the complexities of America's bloodiest conflict. The Gettysburg entry appeared under my fingertips without effort. The Battle of Gettysburg, I read aloud to my empty library, July 1st through 3rd, 1863. I set the book on my reading table and reached for my notepad, a habit from decades of lecture preparation. My fountain pen scratched across the paper. Gettysburg, July 43rd, 1863. Union victory, turning point of Civil War. The words stared back at me, neat and precise. I knew them by heart, had recited them to thousands of students over 4 decades of teaching. Each fact was carved into my memory like names on a monument. I pulled down another volume, then another. The Civil War Encyclopedia, Battles and Leaders, Military History of the United States. Every single source confirmed what I knew to be true. The smell of old books surrounded me, leather bindings, aged paper, the faint mustiness of accumulated knowledge. This library represented my life's work, my passion, my expertise. These books had been my companions through retirement, my solace after Margaret's death, my connection to the world of ideas that had always sustained me. 4 decades of teaching Civil War history, of guiding young minds through the complexities of America's bloodiest conflict, and my own son-in-law dismissed me as a confused older man. I looked up at my diplomas hanging on the far wall. Bachelor's degree from Oregon State, Master's from University of Washington, PhD from Stanford, 40 years at Portland Community College. I published 3 papers on Civil War tactics, and students would still send me Christmas cards, thanking me for inspiring their love of history, all of it meaningless to Trevor apparently. I glanced at the family photo on my desk. Emily at her high school graduation, proud in her cap and gown. She'd always been brilliant, curious, asking questions that challenged me to think deeper. When had she stopped defending intellectual rigor? When had she chosen peace over truth? The encyclopedia still lay open before me. I traced the entry with my finger, each word a small vindication. But vindication for whom? The empty house offered no audience for my rightness. Closing the book gently, I looked toward the family photo again. Emily's young face gazed back at me, full of promise and possibility. That girl would have corrected Trevor immediately, standing up for facts over feelings. What had happened to her? I placed the encyclopedia back in its precise spot on the shelf. The question hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire, unanswered and troubling. 5 days until Christmas. 5 days to decide what kind of man I wanted to be. The week moved slowly. I tended my winter garden, read extensively, and replayed that evening countless times. Each morning brought the same routine: coffee, newspaper, the quiet rhythm of a retired man's life. But underneath the normally, something had shifted. The word fool had burrowed deep, creating an ache that wouldn't fade. Friday morning arrived gray and cold. I stood at my kitchen window, watching snow dust the bare branches of my oak tree. When the phone rang, Dad. Emily's voice carried that forced cheerfulness I'd learned to recognize over the years, the tone she used when trying to smooth over difficulties. Hello, sweetheart. I set down my coffee mug and gave her my full attention. I wanted to call about Christmas, she paused, and I could hear her choosing words carefully. Will you come to dinner with us? We're having a few people over, Trevor's parents, some neighbors, a couple of his colleagues from the firm. The invitation surprised me. After Sunday's confrontation, I'd assumed Christmas would be a small, awkward affair. Of course, does Trevor mind? Another pause. Everything will be fine, Dad, I promise. I walked to her kitchen window, phone pressed to my ear, and looked out at my snow-covered garden. The careful neutrality in Emily's voice told me everything. Trevor didn't know about this invitation, or if he did, he wasn't happy about it. What time should I arrive? Around 6, it's just family and friends. Nothing fancy. Her relief was audible now that I'd accepted. I'm making that crown roast you love. Sounds wonderful. I reached for the calendar on my refrigerator, marking December 25th with my pen. The date looked stark against the mostly empty month. Should I bring anything? Just yourself, Dad, that's enough. As I listened to my daughter's careful invitation, I realized this Christmas gathering might provide the perfect opportunity to address the lingering tension that had settled between us like winter frost. The mention of colleagues sparked something in my memory. Trevor worked at Morrison & Associates, a prestigious consulting firm. Interesting. Emily, I said gently about Sunday. It's forgotten, Dad, ancient history. The words came too quickly, too bright. I'll see you Christmas Day. Okay, ancient history, I repeated after she hung up. The phrase lingered in my mind as I returned to my coffee and newspaper. Ancient history? Exactly what Trevor claimed I knew nothing about. I folded the paper to the local news section, scanning the familiar layout. Obituaries, community events, business announcements. My eyes stopped on a small item. Morrison Associates celebrates successful year. The article mentioned the firm's growth, their expanding client base, their reputation for excellence, Trevor's workplace. Trevor's colleagues would be at Christmas dinner. I set the paper aside and looked at my calendar again. December 25th, circled in blue ink. 5 days to prepare, 5 days to think about what kind of Christmas gift a father might give his son-in-law. The morning light shifted through my window, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering everything in pristine white fresh starts, clean slates. I smiled for the first time since Sunday. The weekend passed quietly. I read, tended my garden, and found myself thinking about Christmas dinner more than usual. By Tuesday morning, Christmas Eve had arrived with that peculiar weight that important days carry. Today felt different. I stood at my bedroom window, watching snow drift past the bare oak branches, and made my decision. If I were going to face Trevor's continued dismissal, I would do it properly. The navy suit hanging in my closet, the one I'd worn to Stockholm when they awarded the Nobel Prize in History to Professor Anderson, seemed appropriate for the occasion. Dressing had always been a ritual for me. 40 years of lectures had taught me that appearance mattered, that respect often began with how you presented yourself. I trimmed my beard carefully, polished my black leather shoes until they gleamed, and adjusted my tie with the precision of someone preparing for an important presentation. The kitchen table became my staging area. Brown paper spread across the surface, gold ribbon curled beside scissors, and Emily's gift waited to be wrapped. I'd chosen carefully a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt that she'd mentioned wanting months ago. She probably thought I'd forgotten, but professors never forget a student's interests. The wine had been more challenging. I'd spent an hour at Morrison's Market yesterday, reading labels and asking questions. Finally settled on a Burgundy from a vineyard Margaret and I had visited during our anniversary trip to France. Not too expensive to seem showy, but good enough to demonstrate that I understood quality. My hands moved methodically through the wrapping process, creasing edges with academic precision. Each fold needed to be perfect, each corner sharp. The biography disappeared beneath elegant brown paper, transformed into something that looked worthy of the occasion. The morning newspaper lay folded beside my coffee cup, headlines announcing Christmas Eve events around Portland. Church services, charity drives, family gatherings, normal people doing everyday things. I wondered how many of them were preparing to walk into situations where their basic competence would be questioned. Church bells chimed in the distance, St. Mary's marking 9. I had 9 hours until Emily expected me. 9 hours to maintain the careful calm I'd cultivated since Friday's phone call. Standing before my hallway mirror, I adjusted my tie one final time. The reflection looked back with steady gray eyes. A man who had spent 4 decades teaching young minds to think critically, to question assumptions, to value evidence over opinion. That man deserved respect regardless of what Trevor Collins believed about confused old fools. My coat hung ready by the front door, leather gloves tucked in the pockets, car keys on the small table where I'd placed them the night before. Everything prepared, everything in its place. As I gathered my gifts and walked toward the garage, I wondered if this Christmas Eve would mark a new chapter in our family's story, or add another layer to an already complicated relationship. The question hung in the winter air like my visible breath, unanswered but somehow hopeful. The engine turned over smoothly, warming in the December cold, while I arranged Emily's wrapped gift and the wine bottle on the passenger seat. 20 minutes across Portland to their house in the Laurelhurst neighborhood. 20 minutes to prepare myself for whatever the evening might bring. I backed out of my driveway and turned toward Emily Street, leaving my quiet house behind. The drive through Portland's holiday-lit neighborhoods gave me time to observe and prepare. Emily Street sparkled with Christmas decorations, each house trying to outshine its neighbors with lights and lawn displays. Their driveway already hosted 4 other vehicles, a BMW, a Lexus, a Subaru, and a practical Honda that probably belonged to neighbors. I parked behind the Honda and gathered my gifts from the passenger seat. Through the large front windows I could see moving figures, hear the distant sound of conversation and laughter, a successful Christmas Eve gathering already in progress. The doorbell's chime brought Emily immediately to the entrance as if she'd been watching for my arrival. Her smile seemed genuine, but carried that edge of nervous energy I'd learned to recognize. "Dad, you look so distinguished." She kissed my cheek, then stepped back to admire my navy suit. "Very professorial. Thank you, sweetheart." I handed her the wrap biography, something I thought you might enjoy. Following her through the entryway, I carried the wine and surveyed the scene ahead. Their living room had been transformed into a holiday showcase. 10F tree draped with white lights, garland framing the fireplace, red and gold decorations creating warmth against cream-colored walls. 8 or 9 guests clustered in comfortable conversation groups, wine glasses catching the flickering fireplace light. Then Trevor's voice cut through the ambient chatter like a blade through silk. Oh ho ho. And here's our confused old man, the one who mixes up his dates. Every conversation stopped. All eyes turned toward me as I stood in the archway, still holding the bottle of Burgundy. The laughter that followed Trevor's introduction rippled through the gathering like water over stones. Each guest uncertain whether this was affectionate family humor or something sharper. Trevor stood near the fireplace, clearly the evening's storyteller, surrounded by 3 younger couples who'd been hanging on his words. His confident grin suggested he'd been entertaining them with family anecdotes, building to this moment of my arrival. "Everyone, meet Martin, Emily's father," he continued, gesturing toward me with theatrical flourish. "He thinks Gettysburg happened in 1863. Can you believe that?" More laughter. Though some guests looked uncomfortable with the public nature of this family ribbing, I maintained my composure, summoning 4 decades of classroom management experience. "Lovely to see everyone here," I said calmly, setting the wine on Emily's side table. Emily moved quickly to my side. "Dad, let me introduce you to the Hendersons from next door. And these are Trevor's colleagues from Morrison." No, Em," Trevor interrupted, clearly enjoying his audience. "Let me tell them about Sunday's argument first. This is educational." An older gentleman near the bookshelf looked up from examining Emily's collection, his expression growing thoughtful as he studied my face. Something about his academic bearing suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with Trevor's performance either. The History Channel documentary was crystal clear. Trevor continued warming to his theme, Gettysburg, 1864. But Professor Emeritus here insists on living in the past with outdated information. The guests' laughter felt more forced now, social politeness overriding genuine amusement. Emily's face had gone pale, her hands twisted into small fists at her sides. I accepted a glass of wine from someone's offered tray and smiled politely at the assembled company. "Thank you for including me in your celebration." But my eyes had found the distinguished gentleman by the bookshelf, who was now watching me with growing recognition in his intelligent features. 15 minutes of polite conversation had passed since Trevor's introduction, and I'd managed to navigate the social minefield with practiced academic grace. The Hendersons proved delightful neighbors, full of stories about their recent trip to Scotland. Trevor's colleagues from Morrison seemed intelligent enough, though they clearly deferred to their host's narrative about family dynamics. I gravitated toward Emily's bookshelf, seeking momentary refuge in the familiar comfort of examining another person's literary choices. Her collection revealed careful thought, historical biographies alongside contemporary fiction, philosophy texts nestled between travel guides. My daughter had inherited good taste in books at least. "Professor Banks." The voice carried such enthusiasm that I turned immediately, wine glass pausing halfway to my lips. A distinguished gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to academic environments. "I'm sorry, Dewey," I began, though something about his bearing suggested familiarity. "Henry Wilson. We worked together at Yale." His face lit up with genuine pleasure. "I taught economics while you were revolutionizing the history department." Recognition dawned like sunrise. "Henry, my goodness, it's been at least 15 years since the faculty retreat in Vermont." He clasped my hand warmly. "You look the same, though I suspect you're enjoying retirement more than those endless committee meetings." Our conversation began to draw subtle attention from nearby guests. The Hendersons paused their own discussion to listen. Even one of Trevor's colleagues glanced our way, curiosity evident in her expression. "Yale, was it?" Mrs. Henderson asked politely. "How wonderful that you two found each other again." Henry's enthusiasm bubbled over. "Found each other, Margaret." This man was a legend on campus. Students would camp outside his office during registration, hoping to get into his Civil War seminars. My cheeks warmed at the praise, though I noticed Emily watching nervously from across the room. She'd positioned herself where she could monitor both our conversation and Trevor's ongoing performance near the fireplace. "Henry exaggerates," I said modestly. "I simply tried to make history relevant to young minds." "Revant?" Henry laughed, turning to address our growing audience. This modest man published the definitive analysis of Gettysburg strategy that's still cited in military me's worldwide. The word Gettysburg seemed to echo through the room like a bell. Conversation near the fireplace faltered slightly, as Trevor's sharp ears caught the reference. His storytelling voice grew louder, competing for attention. Henry continued, oblivious to the family dynamics he was walking into. I remember that faculty dinner when Harvard tried to poach you. The entire history department practically formed a human chain around your office. More guests had begun to drift toward our corner of the room, drawn by Henry's animated reminiscences. The bookshelf provided a natural gathering point, and my old colleague's storytelling was proving more engaging than appetizers and small talk. What was your specialty exactly, Professor Banks? Asked one of Trevor's colleagues, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s. Before I could answer, Henry jumped in with professional pride. Civil War history, particularly battle tactics and political implications, allowed Martin to recite troop movements at Gettysburg from memory, down to the hour. Trevor's voice from across the room grew more insistent, but I noticed several of his audience members glancing our way with obvious interest. The evening's social dynamics were shifting in ways that none of us had anticipated. Emily appeared at my elbow with suspicious timing, carrying a fresh bottle of wine. Dad, would you help me in the kitchen for a moment? But Henry was warming up, and our growing audience seemed genuinely intrigued by these unexpected revelations about the quiet man Trevor had introduced as confused about basic facts. Henry's enthusiasm bubbled over like wine from an overfilled glass. Our small gathering had grown to include the Hendersons, two of Trevor's colleagues, and several other guests who'd abandoned their conversations to eavesdrop on academic reminiscences. 35 years Martin taught at Yale, Henry announced to our expanding audience. Brilliant lecturer. Students would camp outside his office hoping for a spot in his seminars. Mrs. Henderson leaned closer, her earlier politeness replaced by genuine interest. What was your field exactly, Professor Banks? Before I could deflect with my usual modesty, Henry jumped in with professorial zeal. Civil War history primarily. But Martin's real genius was connecting historical patterns to economic theory, interdisciplinary work before it became fashionable. I noticed Emily hovering near the kitchen doorway, her face pale as she watched the conversation unfold. She had positioned herself where she could monitor both our group and Trevor's ongoing performance near the fireplace. His research on the economic consequences of historical events was revolutionary. Henry continued warming to his subject. That's what earned him the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1998. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Complete silence descended on our corner of the living room. Even the background conversation seemed to pause as if the very air had shifted. Wine glasses froze halfway to lips. The Hendersons exchanged startled glances. Did you say Nobel Prize? Whispered one of Trevor's colleagues, a sharp-eyed woman who'd introduced herself as Sarah from the firm. Henry beamed with professional pride. Indeed, the committee recognized his groundbreaking analysis of how major historical conflicts reshape economic systems. His paper on Civil War monetary policy influenced Federal Reserve practices for decades. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or vindication I couldn't tell. Henry, you're too kind. It was collaborative work. Nonsense. He turned to address the growing circle of listeners. This modest man revolutionized how we understand the intersection of history and economics. Harvard tried to steal him away twice. Princeton made offers that would make your head spin. The room's acoustic had changed entirely. Trevor's voice still carried from the fireplace, but his audience was drifting away, drawn by the magnetic pull of unexpected revelation. Even the Christmas music seemed muted against Henry's enthusiastic testimony. I remember the faculty celebration when the Nobel Committee called. Henry continued his academic instincts, fully engaged. The entire history department gathered in the faculty lounge. We'd always known Martin was special, but international recognition. It felt like vindication for all of us. Sarah, the colleague from Morrison, stepped closer. Professor Banks, I have to ask, do you still publish? Research current economic patterns? Retirement has its pleasures, I said carefully, aware that Emily was now moving through the crowd toward us, her expression mixing relief with growing anxiety. Henry caught my diplomatic tone and laughed. Still humble after all these years. Martin, you must tell them about the Smithsonian lecture series you consulted on, but his words were competing with a different sound now, footsteps approaching from across the room. Heavy, purposeful steps that carried the weight of someone whose attention had finally been captured by phrases like Nobel Prize and professor floating above the general conversation. Trevor had noticed the unusual quiet, the gravitational shift of his party guests toward our corner of the room. "Wait, what's all this about a Nobel Prize?" Trevor's voice cut through our gathering like a knife through birthday cake. He pushed through the small crowd with the aggressive confidence of a host reclaiming control of his own party. Henry turned with academic enthusiasm, clearly delighted to share his colleagues' achievements with new audiences. "I was telling everyone about Martin's distinguished career at Yale University." "Distinguished?" Trevor's laugh carried no humor. "This is all nonsense. He doesn't even know basic historical facts." The room's energy shifted again, this time toward discomfort. Guests stepped back slightly, sensing family drama about to explode in their carefully civilized Christmas gathering. "Trevor." Emily's voice carried warning, but her husband was beyond hearing subtle cues. He claimed Gettysburg was in 1863. Trevor continued, his volume rising with his desperation, complete confusion. "I corrected him myself just last week." Henry's expression shifted from enthusiasm to bewilderment. He looked between Trevor and me, trying to process this unexpected hostility toward a respected colleague. "I'm sorry," Henry said carefully, "but Gettysburg was indeed July 1st through 3rd, 1863. That's established historical fact." "No." Trevor's face reened above his expensive sweater. The History Channel documentary was crystal clear. 1864. "I know what I watched." The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Mrs. Henderson touched her husband's arm, a subtle signal about witnessing family conflict. Sarah from Morrison looked fascinated despite herself, watching the drama unfold with professional interest in human dynamics. I maintained my calm, drawing on decades of managing difficult classroom situations. "Perhaps we could verify this online. Most smartphones have internet access." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Trevor hesitated, his confidence flickering for the first time since his aggressive approach. Emily moved closer to her husband, her face tight with apprehension. "Fine." Trevor pulled his phone from his pocket with theatrical determination. "Let's settle this once and for all. Everyone can see how confused old academics get their facts mixed up." Henry watched this exchange with growing comprehension of the family dynamics he'd innocently disrupted. His earlier enthusiasm had cooled to concerned observation. "Trevor, please," Emily whispered. But her husband was committed to his course now, phone glowing in his hands as the assembled guests waited for objective verification. The Christmas tree lights cast gentle shadows across the tense scene. Holiday decorations provide an incongruous backdrop for a confrontation that would either vindicate 40 years of scholarship or confirm Trevor's narrative of confused old age. "Let's see here," Trevor muttered, typing with aggressive confidence. "Battle of Gettysburg date." The room held its collective breath as technology prepared to render judgment on historical truth. Trevor's fingers moved across his phone screen with the confidence of a man confident he was about to prove his point to a room full of witnesses. The small device glowed in his hands like a judicial beacon, ready to deliver verdict on historical accuracy. "Battle of Gettysburg," he announced to our gathered audience, his voice carrying theatrical authority. "Let's see what actual sources say about dates." The screen loaded with modern efficiency. Trevor's eyes scanned the results, his confident expression, beginning its slow transformation into something resembling confusion. "July 1st through 3rd. His voice faltered slightly as he read the search results aloud. 63. Silence stretched through the room like taffy. Even the Christmas music seemed to pause in respect for the moment of revelation unfolding before us. "This can't be right," Trevor muttered, his thumb frantically scrolling through multiple search results. Wikipedia, Encyclopedia Britannica, National Park Service. They all say 1863. Henry finished gently, his academic instincts engaged despite the family drama surrounding us. But Trevor wasn't finished. His desperation had shifted into overdrive, fingers flying across the phone screen with increasing frenzy. "Let me check something else," he announced, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "This Nobel Prize claim, Martin Banks Nobel Prize." I watched my son-in-law's face in the blue glow of his phone screen as the search results populated. Each result drained more color from his features. In 1998, he received the Nobel Prize in Economics, reading in barely audible tones. Martin James Banks, Yale University, for groundbreaking analysis of historical economic patterns. The phone trembled slightly in his hands as he continued scrolling through result after result, each one confirming Henry's enthusiastic testimony about my academic career. Reuters News Archive, Nobel Foundation official website, Yale University faculty history. His voice grew smaller with each confirmation. Emily had moved close enough to see the screen over his shoulder, her face a mixture of relief and concern for her husband's very public humiliation. The other guests stood frozen in fascination, witnessing the complete collapse of their host's confident narrative. Sarah from Morrison leaned forward slightly, her professional curiosity evident as she watched Trevor grapple with objective evidence, contradicting everything he'd believed about his father-in-law. "This is impossible," Trevor whispered, staring at the screen as if willing it to change its display. Henry stepped forward with gentle academic authority. "Martin never mentioned his Nobel Prize because he's genuinely modest about his achievements. It's characteristic of distinguished scholars." The phone screen continued to glow with irrefutable evidence. Photographs from the Nobel ceremony, academic articles citing my research, Yale University's faculty achievement archives, 40 years of professional accomplishment laid bare before the very people who had witnessed my introduction as a confused older man just minutes earlier. Trevor stood motionless, phone clutched in his hand as reality restructured itself around him in front of his Christmas Eve guests. The silence stretched like taffy, thick and uncomfortable as Trevor stared at his phone screen. The device trembled slightly in his hands, its blue glow illuminating a face that had gone through several shades of realization. "Okay, fine." He looked up from the damning evidence, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a cornered animal. "Maybe you got the dates right about some old battle." Watched him grasp for any remaining thread of superiority, his eyes darting around the room for support that was no longer there. "But you never actually received that prize, did you?" Trevor's voice grew louder, more confident, as if he'd found his salvation. "I mean, you didn't go to Stockholm or anything. You're just making that up." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, their wine glasses forgotten in their hands as they witnessed this final desperate attack. "The ceremony was in Stockholm in December 1998, I said calmly, my voice carrying the same measured tone I'd used for thousands of lectures. "Lovely winter evening. The King of Sweden presented it personally." Trevor's face flushed crimson above his expensive holiday sweater. "You're lying. Prove it." I could feel Emily moving closer through the crowd, her face tight with concern for the spectacle her husband was creating. But I remained focused on Trevor, watching his final gambit crumble like sandcastles before an incoming tide. "Carl 16th Gustav," I continued with quiet precision. "Quite gracious, actually. We discussed Swedish economic policy briefly during the reception." "That's impossible." Trevor's voice cracked slightly, the weight of absolute defeat finally beginning to register. "You're just some old professor from a community college." Henry stepped forward with gentle academic authority. "Actually, Trevor Martin taught at Yale University for 35 years, quite prestigious, I assure you." The room had gone completely silent now, even the Christmas music seeming to fade into background whispers. Mrs. Henderson touched her husband's arm, a subtle signal about the discomfort of witnessing this family destruction. Sarah from Morrison was watching the entire scene with fascination, her professional interest in human behavior clearly engaged as she observed her colleague's husband's public breakdown. "This can't be happening," Trevor muttered, scrolling frantically through his phone again as if the search results might have magically changed in the past few minutes. I felt a complex mixture of vindication and genuine pity for this man, who seemed fundamentally incapable of admitting error. 40 years of teaching had shown me many students who struggled with being wrong, but none had ever fought reality with quite this level of desperate denial. "The Nobel Foundation website has photos from the ceremony," I mentioned quietly, "if you're interested in verification." Trevor's phone slipped slightly in his trembling hands as he stared at me, with something approaching genuine horror, the look of a man whose entire worldview had just collapsed in front of his Christmas guests. "Trevor, that's enough." Emily's voice cut through the room like a blade through silk, sharp with authority I hadn't heard from her since she was 16. And defending her younger cousin from neighborhood bullies. She strode across the living room with determined purpose, her holiday dress swishing as she moved between the scattered guests toward the center of our confrontation. Every eye in the room followed her movement. "You're embarrassing yourself and everyone here," she continued, her maternal instincts fully engaged despite the target being her own husband. Trevor whirled to face her, his desperation now tinged with betrayal. I won't stand here and listen to this nonsense. This is all some elaborate joke. Stop this immediately. Emily's voice rose to match his volume. You're acting like a child who can't admit he was wrong. The room collectively held its breath. Witnessing marital conflict in public creates a peculiar social discomfort, like watching someone's private diary being read aloud. Fine. Trevor threw his hands up in theatrical defeat. I'm leaving. I won't be humiliated in my own home by some confused older man and fairy tales about prizes. Then go, Emily shot back without hesitation. But stop making this worse for everyone. Trevor stood frozen for a moment, clearly not expecting his wife to call his bluff. The reality of his situation seemed to hit him like cold water. He had nowhere left to retreat except complete physical withdrawal. Mrs. Henderson whispered something to her husband, who nodded gravely. Other guests were beginning to exchange glances that suggested they were calculating their own exit strategies from this family battlefield. Trevor grabbed his coat from the hallway closet with aggressive efficiency, his movements sharp with wounded pride. His car keys jingled as he fumbled them from the side table. This is ridiculous, he muttered, shrugging into his black wool coat. Absolutely ridiculous. Emily followed him toward the front door, her face a mixture of anger and concern. Despite everything, she was still worried about her husband's emotional state. Trevor, please, she said more quietly. Just drive carefully. He paused at the door, hand on the brass knob, and looked back at the assembled guests who were watching his departure with uncomfortable fascination. Merry Christmas, everyone, he said with bitter sarcasm, then stepped out into the December night. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Through the front window, we could see Trevor's BMW backing out of the driveway with more speed than winter safety recommended. Emily stood at the window watching her husband's tail lights disappear down Laurelhurst Street, her reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. The room remained frozen in uncomfortable silence, guests uncertain whether this marked the end of the evening or if social customs required them to pretend nothing had happened. I crept to Emily's side and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Well, Emily announced to the room after watching Trevor's taillights fade into the winter darkness. Dinner is still warm and I worked too hard on that crown roast to let it go to waste. Her voice carried forced cheerfulness, but I recognized the steel underneath, the same determination that had gotten her through graduate school while working 2 jobs. The guests exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure whether staying would be appropriate after witnessing such intimate family drama. Please, Emily continued, turning from the window with a hostess smile that almost masked her emotional turmoil. I'd really appreciate the company. It's Christmas Eve after all. Henry was the first to respond. Of course, my dear. It smells absolutely wonderful. The others gradually followed his lead, social momentum carrying them toward the dining room like leaves following a current. People are remarkably resilient when permitted to return to normally. As we moved toward dinner, I found myself seated next to Violet Green, Emily's neighbor whom I'd barely noticed during the earlier chaos. She was an attractive woman in her early 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Professor Banks, she said quietly as Emily carved the turkey. I have to say I'm absolutely fascinated by your career. What an extraordinary evening to learn about your achievements. Please call me Martin, I replied, grateful for her calm tone after the recent upheaval, and thank you, though tonight's been rather more dramatic than I typically prefer. Violet laughed softly. I imagine so, but you handled it with remarkable grace. The dinner conversation gradually found its natural rhythm as wine glasses were refilled, and the traditional Christmas meal worked its magic on frayed nerves. Guests began asking respectful questions about my research, my time at Yale, even the Nobel ceremony itself. What was Stockholm like in December? Asked Mrs. Henderson, genuinely curious now that the earlier tension had dissipated. Beautiful, I replied, surprised by how easily the memories flowed. Snow everywhere, of course. The ceremony itself is formal. Tails and white tie, very European tradition. Did you meet other laureates? Sarah from Morrison asked, her earlier fascination with family drama now redirected toward intellectual curiosity. As I shared stories from that remarkable week in Sweden, I noticed Violet listening with particular attention, her eyes bright with interest. Would you perhaps tell me more over coffee sometime? She asked during a natural pause in the conversation. I'd love to hear about your research in more detail. The invitation surprised me, though not unpleasantly. That sounds delightful, Violet. I'd enjoy that very much. Emily, overhearing from across the table, smiled for the first time since Trevor's departure. That's wonderful, Dad. As the evening wound down and guests began their departures, Violet and I exchanged phone numbers with the awkward politeness of teenagers, though we were both well past retirement age. Thursday afternoon, she suggested there's a lovely coffee shop on Hawthorne. Perfect, I agreed, tucking her number into my jacket pocket. Standing in Emily's doorway as the last guest departed, I reflected on the evening's unexpected turns. I'd arrived expecting awkward family dinner conversation. Instead, I witnessed the complete vindication of my professional reputation, the collapse of my son-in-law's illusions, and the beginning of what might prove to be an enjoyable new friendship. Thank you for tonight, Emily said quietly as we watched Violet's car pull away. For being you dignified and kind even when Trevor was being impossible. Family is complicated, I replied, putting my arm around my daughter's shoulders, but truth has a way of emerging eventually. As I drove home through Portland's holiday-lit streets, I realized this Christmas Eve had given me something I hadn't expected. A reminder that even at 68, new chapters were still possible. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.